I haven't been here for the whole hearing, but I just want to walk through some concerns I have based on what I've heard today. And the vile attacks that struck Paris cause us, the immediate reaction to these terror attacks is fear. And it's appropriate, and it makes sense. And when my constituents call the office and their immediate reaction is to want to know what the government is doing to keep us safe, they're right to feel that way. And when they know that one of the people involved, one of the attackers, one of the terrorists, looks like he may have been a Syrian refugee, I understand that their initial thought is that that same thing could happen here. And I understand why there would be a need to want to reevaluate the program, and we should. But we have to be thoughtful about this. And so much of what's gone on in this debate, I think, is not up to what Congress should be doing. The fact is, when we're trying to look at a program, a refugee program, that I know some of this we've gone through already, where the UN High Commission for Refugees refers people to the U.S., and if it's in the U.S., then they're vetted by the Counterterrorism Center and the FBI's Terrorist Screening Center and State and Defense and Homeland Security and fingerprints and biometrics and all the rest. It's a very extensive process, but people are right if they're concerned that they want to be sure that it's perfect. And so, yes, I think it's appropriate for us to pause. But here's what we should remember. Here's what's seemingly missing from this whole debate. The fact is, we've heard it takes 18 to 24 months. So what is it that we should be looking at? The U.S. has admitted 1,800 Syrian refugees. The administration says that half of those are children, a quarter are adults over 60, 2% are single males of combat age. So instead of it's trying to score political points and filing bills that would shut down our country to refugees, which is inconsistent with the values of the nation that we live in, and we've heard that from both sides. Instead of moving forward and engaging in a big political debate about legislation and how to do this, let's acknowledge that there is a system in place. Let's acknowledge that it's exhaustive. Let's also acknowledge that it deserves to be reviewed. And so let's start by taking the 2% of the single males of combat age and look at every one of those cases, and let us have the benefit of the input from all the people who have done the screening to determine whether it's been done correctly, instead of saying that some of the things that have been said that are so inconsistent with who we are. Look, the fact is, it doesn't matter for the Syrians in Syria who are fleeing their country because they're either the victims of, or they fear being the victims of barrel bombs or chlorine gas from Assad, or they fear being raped or murdered by ISIS. In either case, they're refugees. And we've always opened our country to people who are fleeing. So let's figure out how to do this in a rational way. Let's acknowledge that people are afraid, but then let's not make this a political point. Let's figure out how to do something that's actually consistent with who we are as Americans. All we keep hearing is there's no database, there's no database. That's true. And there's not going to be a database in Syria. So does that mean that we stop taking refugees forever if they're fleeing Syria? Because that seems to be the only solution that I've heard from so many of my friends on the other side. One of my colleagues said that these are people, excuse me, that the interviews are fine, except these are people who are adept at lying and deceiving. Well, you know what? Let's start again by looking at single males that we're worried about. But let's acknowledge that a 5-year-old kid and his mother who are fleeing, perhaps having lost their father, that we're not going to go into that thinking, well, unless there's a database that can show that this innocent child isn't somehow involved with terrorism, they can't come into our country. That's absurd. Let's figure out what we can do together, and let's stop making this the huge political battle that's been developing since Paris. We owe more than that, I think, to the American people. And I would just ask our witnesses, since we've already heard I think all three of you have talked about what happens when fear wins. There was a quote in my local newspaper, and when we allow ourselves to be frightened to the point of wanting to seal our borders, rejecting compassion, turning away vulnerable children whose homes have been destroyed, then the terrorists are succeeding because we're letting them. So what steps should we be taking now to both acknowledge that people are afraid, understandably, but that the answer is not to shut down our borders and go after the same people who committed these attacks in Paris? Then that means stopping flights from Brussels and Paris and London and other places where foreign nationals have gone off to Syria and returned. And of course we're not going to do that. Is there, and I'm almost out of time, but can someone speak to the problem that Congress seems to have, where this has become this huge partisan fight when it's really about keeping us safe and being true to our values, both of which we're able to do simultaneously?
Well, I'll take a stab. I mean, I clearly think, obviously, most of us believe we are facing a crisis dealing with ISIS, and I've always found dealing with any kind of crisis that you need people around you that have good judgment. They're tempered, they're measured, but they also have a sense of trying to get the best results in that crisis. And when you're dealing with something like this, there's such a tendency to overreact to it. A huge overreaction would be start sending combat brigades into Syria or Iraq. That's a significant overreaction, but some people will reach for that because they're confident that will truly make a difference. So you try to find something that's going to make a difference. And ISIS actually wants an overreaction. That's another thing. They want it in Europe, and they'll take it any place they can get it. Particularly anything that will fragment the Muslim and non-Muslim population and polarize it. And then the other thing is, you have a tendency to get defensive. See, we close in. We don't want to over-police and trample people's civil liberties. We don't want to all of a sudden start shutting down our borders in ways that don't make any sense for America. And we certainly want to continue a refugee program that's made sense to us for decades. But given the circumstances here, I think the Congress appears, in my judgment, to be taking prudent measures to look at that and to put in place a process that sort of makes some sense. And at the end of the day, I think you got it about right. I mean, we got a 19, 22-year-old youngster standing in front of us in that process, and we have no evidence one way or the other to support anybody's conclusion. It's likely that youngster probably doesn't get in.
Thank you, Mr.
That's
Deutch.
the reality of it.
Thank you. Ms. McSally?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, gentlemen, for your endurance today as we're addressing